Have you ever had a pattern which either has an open top or closes with a magnetic snap, and you wondered if you could modify it to have a recessed zipper panel? Well, the answer is yes, and with some basic math, you can easily add a recessed zipper panel closure to your bag. To add a recessed zipper panel, you first need to modify your lining by cutting a consistent amount off the top of both lining pieces, front and back. But how much do you cut? That amount is really up to you. However, you should take into consideration the total height of your bag, what the top seam allowance will be during the final construction, and are there any interior pockets. Once you've taken these factors into account, you'll have a good idea of the maximum amount you can cut from the top of your lining panels. I've typically found 1.5 to 2 inches to be fairly standard. You will of course need to create a narrow top panel to bring the lining back to the original height once the recessed zipper panel is sewn into place. But how much should that be? This is where you need to do a little math. Because some people do better with written descriptions, others with formulas, and others seeing it in action, I've provided 3 different ways to visualize how to determine the height of the top panel piece. So let's start with the description. You want to consider, as I mentioned, the full height of the original pattern piece. Subtract from that what the amount is that you are going to cut from the top. So what you think you want, you know how much you need to remove. Subtract from that the seam allowance that you're going to use when you're sewing that top panel piece, the bottom panel piece, and your recessed zipper panel. I can talk together. And that's now the height of your bottom panel piece after everything is sewn into place. So let's take that. We're going to take that bottom piece. We're going to subtract that amount from the original height of our pattern piece. So again, full height of the original pattern piece, subtract that bottom panel piece after everything is sewn into place, and that is going to give you the height of the top panel piece once everything is sewn into place. So we're going to take that again, and we're going to go back also to, as you can see, here we go, it's coming up. We're going to take the height of our top panel piece sewn in place, add in that seam allowance that we've determined we're going to use, and that will equal the height of the piece you need to cut. So if you work better with sort of it described out this way, here you go. This is what you need. If you'd like to have a formula, I've kind of put it all together here for you as well, so you can see the formulas. So let's say you want to see it in action though. So here we go. We've got a 15-inch panel piece, as you can see. I know that when I sew this together with the exterior, I have to use a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance at the top. I also know that my lining is going to have both a slip panel and a zipper panel, and I've got 2-inch cutouts at the bottom. So after I take all this into consideration, I feel comfortable cutting off 1.5 inches at the top for that to account for the zipper panel. And so once I've done that, I have to think about, okay, well, how high does that new top panel piece have to be? So if I had a 15-inch piece, pattern piece, and I subtract 1.5 inches, I have a 13.5-inch bottom panel before any sewing is done. So let's now calculate what we need to do to get to the top one. So we're going to take the 15-inch of the original pattern piece, subtract the 1.5 inches, we get the 13.5 inches. From now, we're going to go and take the 13.5 inches. We're going to subtract the seam allowance of 1/4 inch, which is what I'm going to use here. And I'm going to have 13.25 inches. That's the size of my bottom panel piece after everything is sewn. We're going to subtract that from the original height of 15. We'll get 1.75 inches. That's the height of the top panel piece once everything is sewn into place. And when I add back in the seam allowance, it's a 2-inch piece. Sorry, that went a little fast there. Let's see how I sort of draw it out when I do it. And here it comes up. There we go. I have my 13.5 inches. I know that from that, I need to take 1/4 inch. So I draw an arrow and I put over on the other side. In this case, it would be 13.25 inches because that is what the height will be after I sew everything into place. Now I'm going to subtract that number from 15, and that will give me the height of my top panel piece after everything is sewn in place. Now I'm going to add on to that. I'm going to draw another arrow, a 1/4 inch, because that's the seam allowance, and it's going to give me the 2 inches, which is the height that I need to cut in order to have my top side panel piece.
So let's see this in action. We saw the slides where I talk about the formula that you can use, sort of the process. Let me show you how I do this myself when I'm working it out. So this is, let's just pretend this is my exterior. It is a piece that is, did I write it down? Yes, 9 by 9. And as you can see, I cut out some notches because it's going to be a box bottom. So I know ultimately for my interior pieces, my lining pieces, after I cut off the bit at the top and I take all of that into account, I still need the finished sewn piece with the recessed zipper panel to be 9 inches tall. And the width actually isn't as important. It's the height that's important. So I need it to be 9 inches tall. I knew on mine, here I can already show you I started doing some of this, that I was going to cut 1.5 inches from the top. And so, let me get a piece of paper as well so I can show you how I actually do this. But this is what I do. I actually do this writing. Okay, if I know I have a 9-inch piece, but I've cut 1.5 inches off, I have 7.5 inches left. Okay, so I know that this is 7.5 inches. I'm also going to use a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I know that means after I sew in the recessed zipper panel and the top piece, this 7.5 inch actually becomes 7 1/4, because from this you have to subtract your 1/4 inch seam allowance. Okay, so that's 7 1/4 after it's sewn. So what does that mean the top piece is after it's sewn? Well, I'm going to take my 9 and subtract 7 1/4, and that means it is 1 3/4. So my top piece after it's sewn is 1 3/4 inches tall. So that means before you sew it, you have to add back in that seam allowance, that piece has to be 2 inches tall. So I know that when my bottom panel piece cut is 7.5 and my top panel piece cut is 2 inches. When they're sewn together, that's how tall they'll be. And so that's what I did. I mean, this is the math I do, actually with the arrows. So you'll have seen that in the sort of the this example. I used arrows in that. That's because I actually put my arrows in here. I'm the type who does like to write things out. Sometimes when I've got an equation, if it's something new, I will write out the words. That's why I provided that as an example. It helps me to visualize how this equation will work. Other times I just need to draw my numbers, write to my numbers like this, but it helps me to have these arrows in here. It's showing I'm going from this to this, from this to this, and then I'm going from this to this. So however it's going to work out for you, that's what I recommend trying. But as you can see, I put in 2-inch pieces. Let me grab my ruler. So as you can see, that's a 2-inch piece, and this is 7.5. So you can hopefully see that is 7.5 right there. And so that's how long or tall those pieces are. And I've got another one right here. So that takes care of the first part of doing a recessed zipper panel, figuring out the math so that your top panel is the right height. It's not challenging, but sometimes you just need to, if you do it too quickly in your head, you're going to cut something that's too short. I guarantee it. So helpful to have that. The next thing to consider is the length of your panel pieces. So these are the two that I've cut out here. Actually, let me turn it over. One of them has it's a little hard to read, but it says 5 inches. I mentioned in my Gabriella video that someone had, or in a video I had watched while I was learning to sew and sew bags, said that, the basic rule of thumb is that you take the width of your piece and you subtract 2 inches from each side. Now, I don't think that's an exact science, and it can't be, because if you think about it, 2 inches from each side may be enough. In some cases, may not be enough. It depends on how you're sort of sewing your bag together. This is going to have box corners, but what if the corners were bigger? Or what if I had side pieces? And that would change how the whole thing comes together. let's think about this for a minute. If I sew this together with, let's say, a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, okay, let's look at this. Let's put this right in the middle. And if I do a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, so let me get the other one out of the way so you're just seeing the one. Okay, you can see that. That's a lot of space there, you'd think. But don't forget, this is going to come up as well because we have the box bottom that we're doing. It's going to change the shape of this to be more of a rectangle because that's what we're going to have here. And so that's what you also have to take into consideration when you're cutting these out. What's your seam allowance going to be? Are you boxing your bottom? How wide is the base? So that 4 inches or the 2 inches on each side is probably not a bad guide. You might play around with it as you start to get used to a pattern. You may know, oh, I can do 1.5 inches here. Maybe I need to do a little more. The last thing we all want is one of these zipper panels where it's so tight that it's really hard to get in and out. So that's why, sometimes you want to err on the side of caution, have it be a little wider. What I thought we would do for this, just to see what would happen, we've got these. So these were 5 inches. I folded them in the way we normally would. I drew a 1 inch line on each, folded them in, so it's 1/2 inch folded in. So we do have something that's 4 inches long. I'm not going to put a whole zipper in here. I'm not going to do all of that. The main goal is to see how it would be if we were to do that. So I'm just going to do that right there. So we've got this one all set. I cut out a second because, as I said, let me move this a little more out of the way. We would instinctively think, oh, that is so short. I can't use that. And so I cut one out that was 6 inches, as you can see here. And again, folded it in, so it's now a 5 inch piece. If I were to look at that, I would think to myself, well, that's got to be much better. But is that going to be too long then, even though it doesn't look it? Let's see what happens. So I thought I would do both of those like that. Quick sew. This is just some scrap fabric or waterproof canvas. But I thought this would be a good way to sort of see what happens here. So let's go over to the sewing machine and see how it goes. So we have all 4 of our panel pieces. So I'm going to do 2 bags here. I'm going to sew them all in 1/4 of an inch. I will top stitch them because that's what we would do. Just want to make that part as accurate as possible. Then once I'm done with that, I'm going to sew all these together as I would any kind of bag or pouch with a boxed bottom, and I'm going to do that at 3/8 of an inch, so that way we'll be able to see how that would look. So we're going to take a look at that and see, and then we'll compare how the zipper panels look. So let's get started with that.
La 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 la. There's probably more to this tune, but I don't know it. Da 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 da. Ba 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 da 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 da.
Not today, bobbin. That's my bobbin thread. This one's clipped together a little more than I would have liked, but I'm using, what I did was, as you can see, hopefully you can see here, I clipped together, there we go, where the panel pieces are. Obviously, they would not be quite so close together with a zipper. These two, in fact, are overlapping. It's because I used water-resistant canvas for this, so it's thinner. But it gives you an idea. Remember, once we sew this together, the sides are going to be like this. When we would sew this to the exterior, the sides will be like that. You can see, here, hopefully you can see, let me get some light in there. There's not that much space between the end of the zipper tab, or the zipper panel, I'm sorry, and the edge of the bag. because once we sew it together, I mean, it's because we've got this box bottom here, and that's a pretty big box. It sort of takes up a lot of that. Oops, sorry, there we go. So hopefully you can see that. Let me see if I can bring it a little closer. Get my light in here. There we go. So hopefully you can see there's not a ton of space. So imagine zipping and unzipping. You normally want to have a little bit of extra space so the tail can be pushed in easily. Take it out so you can hold it to zip and unzip. Let's look at, so this is the one, and you can even see it. It says 5, hopefully right there. I wasn't being super careful with the directions of everything. This is the one that had the 6 inch, and let's look at this one. Let me clip this one again. Hold on. You can see, I mean, if we look into it, you would think, okay, yeah, that one looks good, but you can remember this is going to square up. Don't drop it. Back. Okay, so this, let me try to get this kind of pulled all straight here. That'll help. Imagine once it's sewn in, this is going to square more. And you can kind of see, I mean, I can feel, here's the other thing too, I can feel right here along the edge, you can see where it's going to want to basically sort of form that square. That is right at the edge of the zipper panel. I don't know how well you can see, that's right at that edge. That's where it naturally wants to do it. You can see right here, here's the edges of our box bottoms. There we go, sorry. And you can sort of imagine it's wanting to form there. And so it's pretty close. It is really quite close on that end. Hopefully you can see that. There's not a lot of space to work with there. There we go. There's not a lot of space to be able to put in the tail, take it out easily. This would be one of those where it's a bit tighter. Now maybe that's what you want, and that's fine. If you wanted something like that, that's the way to go. Do it that way. If you want something with a little more space, I mean, using that rule of 2 inches on each side, it's not a bad rule. As I said, I tend to think about a number of things. What will my seam allowance be? What is the base going to be like? How wide is that going to be? All of that will help me determine whether maybe I want to go with 1.5 inches off each side or 2 inches. I'm somewhere in between there usually, but I find it to be, you know, a decent rule to work with. At least a good starting point. So hopefully this all helped a little bit. Our funny little sample bags helped you learn how to, if you were kind of struggling or wondering, how do I do, sort of modify my panels so I can do a recessed zipper panel, and how do I determine how long my recessed zipper panels should be. Hopefully this helped, and I'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.